ladies and gentlemen, to give the 2014 Bishop Sir Paul Reeves Memorial Lecture, Dr. Mary Quin.
Tēnā koutou katoa, kua hui mai nei, he honore māku ki te kororo I tēnei wā. Hei mō mahara ia tā Paura Reeves, he rangatira Ranganui, he rangatira Rangimārie no te Atiawa. Kei te mihi ki aia, kei te mihi ki koutou hoki, I ronga I te kaupapa ara ko ta rangatiratanga auaha. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I feel really honoured to have been invited to give this lecture this evening to commemorate the incredible work of Sir Paul Reeves. As a Kia, a Kiwi expatriate abroad for so many years, 37 actually, I did not have the opportunity to know much of Sir Paul before the invitation to give this lecture, and so it was a real gift having the opportunity to learn about his work, his leadership, and his contributions to reconciliation, to justice, to peace in New Zealand, an extraordinary New Zealand leader. And I had read his leadership style referred to as refined and a softer version of leadership than is the norm in New Zealand, where we're a land that celebrates perhaps a more rugged individualist style of leadership. So I reflected on that, thinking, you know, there are many kinds of leadership, and how wonderful that someone who brought forward a very different vision for leadership could have had the chance to impact so many lives. I thought very much about the different ways to lead as I prepared for my remarks this evening, and what it means to all of us, because I think all of us at different times and places are called upon to be leaders in one way or another. And this year, Leadership New Zealand is exploring the idea of creative leadership. And so I think it's particularly interesting to think about leadership in the context of innovation, which after all is a very creative process. And it's the kind of leadership that I understand from what I've read, from what I've heard, that Sir Paul truly exemplified in his many roles as Bishop, as Governor-General, as Chancellor, and leading delegations and commissions in New Zealand and throughout the world. So I spent also some time looking back into my past, and David has given probably a much too generous description of it, but for which I thank him. But I looked back and dug out a couple of old scrapbooks that I kept in the 1970s when I was a high school student and into my days as an undergraduate at the University of Canterbury, and looking to see what indicators there might be of where my career would lead and the prospects for leadership. So I came across a letter that I had saved in the scrapbook, and it's dated the 3rd of November 1970. It's from the manager of Woolworths in Palmerston North. At that time, I would have been finishing 6th form and had taken the university entrance exam and the bursary exam that year. The subject of his letter to me was my application for holiday employment. And the letter was, "Dear Mary, I am sorry to advise you that your application has not been successful." Not was in capital letters, in case I missed the point. "May I take this opportunity to thank you for coming in to apply? The standard of applicants was very high, and there were a great number of them, which made our choice a difficult one. Kind regards, yours faithfully, I won't name him, manager of Woolworths at Palmerston North. So my career did not start auspiciously. Turned down for a job in sales at Woolworths, and the standard so high I didn't make the cut. I do recall there was an arithmetic test, but I don't think that was the reason I didn't make the job. But fortunately, things did pick up, and I came across another letter, literally in this scrapbook, and this was from the Associated Motor Industries Limited on the Western Hutt Road in Petone. This was dated 31st of October 1974. And at this stage, I would have been about halfway through my degree in physics and maths at the University of Canterbury. And this letter said, "Dear Miss Quin, thank you for your letter of the 24th. We are able to confirm employment for you during the summer vacation. You would be employed in our trim or paint departments, and we can offer a commencing rate of $1.82 per hour. Yours faithfully, the Assistant Personnel Officer." Now, I was ecstatic because the university was paying me $1.10 an hour as a physics research assistant, and I was going to get $1.82 an hour on the assembly line. And that was my introduction to the world of manufacturing. I got to put the wiper blades on Austin Maxis and the decal on the back of the vehicle, the last step before they went off the assembly line and someone put petrol in the tank. So that was for the summer of 1974. The factory closed 10 years later in 1984. And by 1998, the last 3 auto assembly plants in New Zealand closed down. How good was the leadership of those plants? How good was the management? We don't know. They may have been outstanding, but they could not withstand the tidal wave of imported, fully assembled vehicles as the erected seawall, if you like, of tariffs were removed. And very often, the tides of change are driven by technology, and that technology may be an entirely new product, or it may be capabilities for how a product is actually manufactured. And often we hear talk about manufacturing jobs today and the importance of bringing back manufacturing jobs, but most of the factories I have been in the United States, I would say, and in Japan, there are very few people in those factories. Everything is done by robots and software. The jobs for the people are designing the robots and the software, not actually working in the factories. So processes and products are swept away as better and cheaper alternatives take their place. There are familiar products around us now that after decades of use and familiarity to us, are disappearing. The landline phone, as I look to my nephew Chris Quin from Spark in the audience, the checkbook, the fax machine, all of them as endangered as the kakapo. So while some products and technologies are disappearing, new technologies are being invented today, and they are already defining what our lives will be like in the future. And these technologies are important often not just for themselves, but how they are being combined in innovative ways to create new products and services that are shaping economic outputs and outcomes for countries and are shaping daily lives for people all around the world. Now, just because many of these technologies are invented and applied outside of New Zealand does not mean that a country the size of New Zealand geographically and in population cannot be actively engaged in making a contribution to these new technologies, and indeed we are. And in fact, I would say we have no choice but to run with the big dogs or get left behind. As the saying goes in the dog sledding world of Alaska, if you're not the lead dog, the view never changes. In 2009, another extraordinary Sir Paul Callaghan, published his influential book, Wool to Weta. And this book was a call to action to New Zealand to recognise that we could not indefinitely continue to depend for our standard of living and quality of life on the primary industries, on agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and that we needed to continue and even more intensively invest in science and technology and build companies and industry sectors that were based on the cutting-edge technologies that were developed either here or around the world. So Paul was a scientist, an academic and entrepreneur. And in fact, it is, of course, after him that Callaghan Innovation, that I'm now privileged to lead, was named. The title, Wool to Weta, sort of implies that he was suggesting primary industries should be replaced with high-tech industries such as software and medical devices, robots, and unmanned aerial vehicles. But I believe that the future for New Zealand is not a matter of changing from one to the other, but rather a matter of having the best of both. I believe our future must be dairy, digital, and drones, an economy that's equally balanced on our natural resource sector, on digital and database industries, and on the companies that are producing sophisticated manufactured goods. Wool has declined from 25% of New Zealand's exports to just 2% in the last 4 decades, so certainly within my lifetime. And the dramatic increase in the world demand for dairy products and New Zealand's very successful response to that demand means that primary industry exports have actually increased in the last decade from 59% to 71% of New Zealand's exports. The growth in the primary sector has not been matched by growth in digital industries and in technology-driven advanced manufactured goods. So just as a financial portfolio needs rebalancing when one sector of the portfolio is exceptionally successful, so too does New Zealand's economic portfolio need rebalancing. Let's consider for a moment what these new technologies might be. At Callaghan Innovation, we've been identifying 7 broad areas of technology that we see currently and into the foreseeable future underpinning many of the opportunities for high-tech, high-value manufacturing and services companies. And these are, of course, information and communications technologies, advanced materials, sensing and automation, which includes robotics, biotechnologies, food processing technologies, and 2 more that the purists might say are not really technologies, but bear with me, design and manufacturing, and also standards and compliance, 2 areas of technical expertise that are really critical to many industries and to many innovative products. So if we think about what it takes to turn an innovative idea and get it ready to sell into world markets, we find that it will depend very often on not just one, but several of those 7 major technology areas. And so I'd like to think about drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, as one example of this. A drone, in effect, is a miniature airplane or a miniature helicopter. It can be fixed wing or rotating wing. And various devices can be attached to this drone, and it could be a camera, a video camera or a thermal camera. It could be a sensing device of some kind. It could be even a boom for spraying crops, or it could be a rocket launcher. Many applications for drones. But clearly there's a lot of technology that underpins designing and building such a product. First, the right materials that have the right weight and strength characteristics, the resistance to corrosion, many properties that are needed to pick the right product so that that UAV will work. Sensing technologies to send a signal to Earth, receive it back. The signals require digital processing to turn those signals into a meaningful set of information or an image. And of course, the control of the drone itself requires communications technologies. And also the standards. In every country, standards for operating drones vary. And so for the manufacturer or the operator, having a good understanding of the standards that apply in the intended export market are critical. Believe it or not, the US does not actually allow the commercial use of drones at all at present. This policy is being re-examined, but it means that New Zealand drone manufacturers and designers have had a window of opportunity to surge ahead in their understanding and development of these products, and potentially being much more competitive when the US market does open up. So we've got a lot of technology that's come together. It's made it possible to make UAVs far cheaper, far more versatile, possible to apply them to many more different applications. And the interesting thing is that while the military applications tend to get most of the news coverage and perhaps the more dramatic applications, in reality, agriculture is by far the largest use of unmanned aerial vehicles. MIT, that is Massachusetts Institute of Technology, recently ranked agricultural drones as the #1 breakthrough technology for 2014. And the Association for UAVs internationally predicts 80% of the commercial market will eventually be for agricultural uses. And what are these agricultural uses? The great thing about UAVs, and they don't have a very long flying time, 15, 20 minutes, and they must generally always be operated within line of sight of the person controlling the device, which means they have to be below any cloud cover, and if weather conditions are not good, they can't be used at all. But they are used very extensively for examining the condition of crops, for looking at the impact of droughts or floods, for locating livestock, particularly in rugged terrain, for looking at the requirements for fertilization and irrigation. And not only is that valuable to the operation of the individual farm, but data can then be compiled for multiple farms and giving a sense of climate change, water management issues across wide areas of land. So a very high-tech product, and yet very closely tied to our primary industries. And an example of why we need to be in natural resources, digital technologies, and sophisticated manufactured goods. We cannot be in just one or the other. The good news is New Zealand has a number of manufacturers and designers of drones. Who knew? I certainly wouldn't have guessed before I came back and got to meet the founders and leaders of some of these companies. And these companies are not in the major metropolitan areas. In Raglan, we have Aeronavics, a small business that is producing multi-rotor UAVs, and these are sold around the world for aerial photography, for filmmaking and industrial applications. In Palmerston North, we have Hawkeye UAV, used for farm mapping, for pasture measurement, and for surveying. And they are also selling now into 9 countries around the world. In Tauranga, GPS is using UAVs to map and audit kiwi fruit orchards, and in particular, following the spread of PSA disease. So we have these remarkable companies in small towns around New Zealand coming up with world-leading technology, making a difference in our fundamental primary industries, and exporting these products all over the world. Truly an era of dairy, digital, and drones. I'll move on now to another field or a group of technologies that perhaps more than anything else is broadly changing how our lives will be in the future. And this is the capture, analysis, and linking and interpreting of vast amounts of data, what is referred to as big data. It's estimated that more data is now generated every day than the entire human race generated up to the year 2000. And as technologies improve to be able to analyze and make sense of this huge amount of data, there will be products and services that we cannot yet even begin to envision. But let's think about some of the things that we can envision. I believe that big data really has two major areas of impact, and one is on getting a sense about big issues, total populations, and trends, but the other is about understanding right down to the individual human being and their needs and preferences. So let's think about health data as an example. Historically, data about health has been extremely fragmented. There can be handwritten notes by a doctor in his or her office, electronic records of drug prescriptions made out perhaps at a pharmacy store, results of clinical trials for a medical device conducted with a few hundred patients at a hospital, global tests of a new drug from a multinational pharmaceutical company, and all of this information still today very much is in separate silos, much of it not even in digital form, and what is digital often spread across quite incompatible files and software applications. But countries are establishing new laws and protocols allowing or even requiring the standardization and sharing of this health-related data. And the potential is huge to see patterns and outcomes that were previously invisible to us. Insights into cause and effect of different treatments, comparisons across different population groups. A drug may behave very differently used for women, for instance, than it does for men. So we'll see a very rapid increase, acceleration at the rate at which knowledge is shared and linked and applied both to populations and to the individual. The big change for individuals from these technologies will be a much more personal and holistic view of each person's health status, combining genetic profile, medical history, lifestyles, allergies, accidents that may have occurred in a person's life, and their response to past treatments. And so once all this data can come together and we each have that personal profile, healthcare, again, will take huge leaps forward, as it won't be a matter of just guessing that because something worked for the average person in the population, that it will work for this particular individual. So technologies have enabled this data to be managed, continuing to enable it to be linked and to be interpreted. But technology is also helping overcome another barrier, and that has been the fear of loss of privacy. In the United States, this has been a big barrier to digitizing healthcare records. The fear that once it was in digital form, even accessible on the cloud, how would we individually control our personal information? But new technology tools are overcoming that issue as well, so that data privacy and control of personal information can also be assured. Now, if we then go on and combine video conferencing technology with health sensing and health records, it allows patients to be examined without ever visiting the hospital or the doctor's office. And in remote areas, and in Alaska as an example, this telemedicine is becoming increasingly prevalent. In the Alaska Native villages that I frequently visited, every clinic had telemedicine capability. It meant that many villages, in fact most of Alaska, except for the few major towns, is off the road system. You cannot get there except by plane or in some cases by boat. So it means that someone living in one of these communities is now able to be to consult with and to be examined remotely by a specialist, by a doctor in a hospital in Anchorage or in Seattle or in Auckland. And they do not need to take necessarily, before that diagnosis is made, that bush plane flight followed by a commercial flight and staying in accommodations in a strange city far from their families. Sometimes, too, the weather makes travel impossible. So remote and tough geographies can actually create demand for innovation and be a very receptive market for cutting-edge new technologies. It's not so long ago, or certainly within the last 100 years, that the technology needed to get a diphtheria serum to the town of Nome was achieved with a series of dog sled teams. And these dog sled teams in the middle of winter took the diphtheria vaccine to the city of Nome, which was experiencing an extremely serious epidemic. The event actually is now the origins of the Iditarod race, in which about 80 dog teams compete every year to run that same 1,000 miles across Alaska. The fastest complete the race now in fewer than 9 days. And it's a major tourist attraction in the winter in Alaska. And in fact, there have even been the occasional New Zealander competing in that race. So I would highly recommend it if you ever find yourself in Anchorage on the first Saturday in March. Because what you have to understand that is in Alaska, dog mushers and their lead dogs have the same status as the All Blacks do in New Zealand. In actual fact, dog sledding is a tougher sport because, to my knowledge, no All Black has yet been killed by a moose while competing. I'd like to move on to thinking a bit about New Zealand's image. So we have these fantastic technology companies. Their only challenge is they're generally quite small, and so growing them is a big part of the mission of Callaghan Innovation. But a big part of our challenge also is to ensure that New Zealand worldwide is perceived not just as a clean green country, which is certainly a very highly valued and important part of our image, but that it's also seen as a country of high technology, where leading edge technology is developed and is converted to product. And as shared with you earlier, the idea that we're not just 100% pure, but a land of pure genius, because there really are some ingenious ideas all around the country, and it's been perhaps the most exciting part of my year and 18 months or so back in New Zealand to discover many of these companies. We can think about Vend. It's a point-of-sale software company, just been named as one of the hottest companies in the TIN 100, the Technology Innovation Network's 2014 list of companies, and growing fast and exporting its retail software all over the world. Rocket Lab recently unveiled a small, lightweight carbon composite rocket capable of sending satellites into space for a fraction of the usual cost. And in our Lower Hutt labs at Callaghan Innovation started a company called Mesynthes, which invented breakthrough products for treating serious wounds. And that technology originates from the tissue of sheep. So again, an amazing example of how our primary industries can lead to high-tech healthcare or communications products, or even solutions to protect our environment. There does not need to be a conflict between being a beautiful, clean, safe country and also being a high-tech, leading edge and capable of manufacturing sophisticated goods and exporting them. We can and must be both high-tech and high-touch. I'd like to think about dairy again as an example. Synthetic milk. There's a product being developed by an American company called Moo Free. Love to know who their branding people were. Which uses research facilities actually in Ireland, and it may very well be a viable alternative to milk products from cows. Maybe not next year, but within 5 years, who knows? Synthetic milk could do to our dairy industry what polyester did to wool, and recall wool dropped from 25% of exports to 2% in 4 decades. So we can either ignore and deny the threat of emerging food technology, or we can invest in being world-class both at natural milk and synthetic milk, shifting natural milk over time to being a high-end, highly valued premium product with maximum margins, And synthetic milk is a lower priced, everyday, mass market product, more competitively priced. Our goal should be to dominate the world in milk, regardless of whether it comes from cows, yeast, soybeans, or almonds. And given the current pressures on our environment, especially our lakes and rivers from more intense dairy farming, there is clearly a limit to the amount of natural dairy products a country with New Zealand's geography can provide. So as a desirable item becomes even more scarce in proportion to demand, there's that opportunity for higher prices when we have a limited amount of land. Let's generate the highest margins from every hectare. Emerging wool companies did the same thing as polyester replaced many of the products that had previously been made from wool or cotton. Icebreaker, as an example, demonstrated that it could use branding and fantastic design to break into the outdoor clothing market and to command price premiums above the synthetics and the polyesters. Armadillo Merino has demonstrated that wool has superior properties to synthetics to minimize injuries from burns. Wool has a much higher temperature before it catches fire, and it does not melt into the skin, and causing much better protection, particularly to soldiers and to firefighters whose jobs put them at high risk of explosion and fire. And so as demand for these more specialized products from wool continue to increase, at some point we may reach the limit of the amount of merino wool that our limited geography can produce. Again, let's get the maximum price, the maximum value from every hectare of land devoted to merino sheep. Technology will continue to constantly advance with new discoveries and inventions, and the most dangerous thing we can do is to be unaware or dismissive of technologies that potentially threaten our current exports. I did go to a job at Kodak in 1988. It was after completing my MBA, and it was to a middle management role with the copier division, because at the time I was very keen to use my MBA to transition away from hands-on R&D and to gain experience in other business functions. It was surprising how hard it was to do that, actually, because everybody kept wanting to give me research jobs. The potential for digital photography back then in 1988 to replace silver halide film was already quite clear to the leadership, to the management and board of Kodak, Eastman Kodak Company. Yet Kodak leadership failed to embrace the new photographic technology for fear of cannibalizing its existing business, the little yellow boxes. Of course, other innovative companies cannibalize their product for them, and a workforce of about 80,000 employees in Rochester, New York, is now about 8,000. The company had developed a culture of discouraging frank conversations and discussions and shooting the messenger of bad news. And when a company makes those mistakes, it goes out of business with the loss of jobs for a community. But if a country makes those mistakes, it may lower the standard of living for its citizens and residents, possibly for decades to come. So the business growth agenda is of tremendous importance to all New Zealanders. I would offer that creative leadership is, by definition, not afraid of dissenting views or unconventional perspectives. In fact, creative leaders must seek out diversity of thought, and that means having a diverse workforce around you, whether it's in the lab, whether it's in the senior management, whether it's in the boardroom. It means encouraging and listening to both intuitive as well as analytical and numbers-driven thought processes. And it means tapping a variety of people in the organization, among your customers, among your suppliers, to get the optimum solution. I like to think I've had some good ideas in my career, but I am certain that even my best ideas have been improved upon by input from my team or my colleagues that I was working with at the time. Sir Ken Robinson notes in his TED lectures on creativity that creative leadership is not necessarily about leaders coming up with creative ideas themselves. In fact, very often they don't. Creative leadership is about creating an environment which unleashes creativity throughout the entire organization. And I think it's true also, if we are to be a more creative and innovative nation, we must tap the creativity of all New Zealand citizens and residents, whether their family origins here extend back hundreds of years, or whether they arrived here as immigrants or students just a few months ago, whether they live in New Zealand currently or whether they live offshore. Creative leadership must adapt to the situation. And sometimes the person who is the nominal leader isn't the right person to cope with a particular challenge, a particular market threat, or a particular risk. And I learned this very clearly back in my Alaska days. I was on a recruiting trip to the Alaska Native villages where the shareholders of the company lived. An important part of our mission was, as a company, this was an outsourced services company in Alaska, an important part of its mission was to create employment opportunities for the Inupiat people who were the shareholders of the company. And many of them still lived in traditional and subsistence lifestyles in villages above the Arctic Circle. So we decided we would do a recruiting trip by snow machine, and I thought this sounded like a good thing to do. And I joined our group of half a dozen who were going to go and visit the 11 villages in the Northwest Arctic region and interview people and identify people who could join us and work for the company. So after a 5-minute lesson on how to operate a snow machine in the parking lot of the only hotel in Kotzebue, I found myself on a 100-mile journey across the frozen north. And all went well for 3 days until we were crossing a small river about 10 miles away from the next village. Some of the time I'd been operating my own snow machine, but at this stage I was sitting on the back of one operated by an Inupiat who was one of the vice presidents on my senior management team, Eric. The 4 machines ahead of us got across the river just fine. We got halfway across and the ice started cracking. This was not a good moment. We were not too far from the shore, but suddenly Eric is yelling at me, "Get off, get off." He didn't have to tell me. I was off that snow machine and taking leaps across the bits of fast-breaking ice as fast as I could. I made it to shore, turned around to see Eric and the snow machine slowly sinking into the frozen water. And this was a situation where I knew I was not the boss anymore. The local people understood how you get a snow machine out of a frozen river. Unfortunately, it meant somebody, and it turned out to be Eric, had to stand in the river for about 5-10 minutes, getting the snow machine upright so that the ones that were on the far bank could tow it out of the water. The unfortunate thing was that this snow machine was a brand new one. It was the prize we were going to give away. Because to entice people to apply to jobs and come to the company to work for us, everybody who took a job with us as a result of this recruiting trip and stayed in the job at least a month would be eligible for a draw to win the snow machine. I'm not sure if we ever actually let on that it had had a baptism of sorts on the way. But that was a situation where I had no clue how you dealt with those circumstances. And Eric later said, "Mary, I'm sorry I yelled at you." I said, "You did absolutely the right thing. You knew what needed to be done, and I did not." So let me just touch on a couple of final points. When I meet business owners and leaders around New Zealand, I always ask them, what is holding you back from growing your company bigger and growing it faster? And I can pretty much put money on it that the answer will be one or both of 2 things. Either we can't find enough skilled employees, or I can't find venture capital. Just as we have a limited amount of land, we also have a limited population. So not only do we need to make sure every hectare is used to its full potential, we need to make sure all of our current and potential workforce are also used to their full potential. And that means having a world-class education system, providing the wide variety of skilled graduates that businesses need. We do have a strong education system, but I would like to suggest that education is one field that not just here, but everywhere in the world can be using technology even more quickly to radically change how knowledge is transferred from one human to another. And I'd like to see two things happening. First is a much more holistic view about education. And so that rather than thinking of it as in these chunks of primary, secondary, tertiary, followed by a lifetime of work, that we think about work and learning and playing as things that we do in parallel throughout our lives. It may be a matter of going back and studying a new subject to make a change in career. It may be adding skills to be more effective, to move up to a higher level of responsibility in an existing career, or it might be education just in pursuit of a hobby, a personal interest, or in pursuit of supporting a non-profit organisation. Since moving back to New Zealand last year, I have started, as you've heard, slowly to learn Te Reo Māori. It's an important part of Callaghan Innovation's mission to ensure our services and strategies support the aspiration of Māori-owned businesses. So for me, it was important to develop some understanding of the language and the culture to be more effective in achieving this part of our organisation's mission. But it was also something that is of personal interest to me. Now, so far, I am finding more occasions to use and practice my te reo lessons than I've found time to use the other course that I've taken in the last year, and this one was at Tawa College. It was 4 sessions on how and where to surf, cast and rockfish around the Wellington region coastline. As they say, give a woman a fish and she will feed her family for a day. Teach a woman to fish, and in my case, she becomes downright dangerous. I have an uncanny ability to catch a fish hook in whatever or whoever may be behind me. But it will be a relief to the deer stalkers of New Zealand that my mishaps with fishing do not seem to also take place when I'm hunting. We have a huge opportunity to fully integrate learning from educational institutions with the learning that can take place in the workplace or in the community. And just as we have an opportunity and happening in the future to integrate all of the health knowledge we have about each individual, what a great opportunity to reinvent and pull together all of the education and skills and training that each individual has, whether they've gained it from high school, from a university, from an apprenticeship, whether it was a 10-week training course in sales that they gained working for a multinational computer company, whether it was taking an online course to learn Japanese before a vacation trip, whether it was taking bookkeeping or improving one's public speaking skills at a Toastmasters club. Why not be able to bring all of that information together so we have a total picture of the capability and skills of every one of our people? The other major change in education is, of course, already well underway, but it means that in the digital age and with video conferencing capability, we have the opportunity for everyone to have access to the best teachers in the world, with students of any age, hearing and seeing subjects explained from whoever the expert is, regardless of where they are located in the world and regardless of what decile school the student is attending. This will involve breaking down what we've traditionally thought of as the role of a teacher and separating out those functions that do actually need to be physically done in the classroom from those roles that can be delivered remotely. So it may be that remote can be the actual content of lectures, the communication of the material, taking tests, grading test results, comparing performance against national and international standards of students, while the work that must be in the classroom is of coaching and encouraging, maintaining discipline, and of course, in many subjects, the hands-on experimental and lab work that needs to be done. So I think here in New Zealand, as a compact country, we have a fantastic opportunity to lead the world in reinventing the way education is done and the way every individual is able to achieve their full potential in the workforce at whatever stage of life they are at. Sir Paul Reeves, in his role as Chancellor of this university, would surely be urging us forward in those objectives, as would Sir Paul Callaghan. So I think we have an unprecedented era coming forward in the future of connectivity across many different fields of science. And that means leaders must be willing to think about and engage with a wide variety of technologies, to be aware of knowledge about many different fields of science, because we never know in what ways opportunities might arise to link different fields of technology in new and innovative ways. And that also means, as leaders, we must surround ourselves with diverse points of view. In New Zealand, I believe we truly can run with the big dogs. We can take our ideas to the world, and it can be a world that sees us as not just a wonderful place to come as a tourist and not just a source of food and fibre products, but truly a centre of innovation, a place we can lead creatively, where we can inspire creativity in those around us. The view will be constantly changing because we will be creating the view and creating the future we want for ourselves, our children, and generations to come. Thank you.